Let's come to our 32nd presentation for this year of the Parayana. We have been moving in very large layers, and the next very large layer to come into play for a while is Islam. We've been looking at the way in which civilization has a dynamic, and that the dynamic in the universe, in the cosmos, is time. The most primordial energy in the universe, in the cosmos, is time as a dimension. So the emphasis is that time is the dimension. It's the first dimension, but time emerges spontaneously, not instantly. Once time has occurred, its emergence has occurred spontaneously, then one can have instantaneity, and space instantly blossoms from time in three dimensions, a triad, a triple. So that there is a primordial geometry between 0, 1, and 3, with the illusion that the 0 cannot count. And so to make up the triad, the triplet, we count the 2. 1, 2, 3. And as George Gamow entitled one of his great books from the 1950s, I remember buying a copy in the Mentor paperback, 1, 2, 3, ... infinity. With infinity being the word, not the symbol, not the Mobius strip. And as I have related, I got to meet George Gamow in 1960 at Sequoia National Park, where I was the head porter and he was staying for a week in his red car, convertible, with matching elkskin suitcases and his beautiful blonde wife. And I thought, this is a physicist, George Gamow. It was wonderful, burly, elegant, and dear. 1, 2, 3, ... infinity. Once one has the relationship of 1, 2, 3, and understands that 0 is the field out of which they occur, the arithmetic continuity of proceeding by ones, 1, 2, 3, increases with the sense then that whatever is because it is definable, is because it has a registry, but the articulation of its registry is that all of these ones in their arithmetic continuity occur in a 0 field. So that the ones, whatever is particality, whatever is particular, whatever is definable, occurs as a quantum. And the articulation of the quantum is because there's not something in between them and the next, but that they occur within a 0 field. So that the articulation is because the entire field is not only a 0 field, but a fertile 0 field. So that on a very deep, high dharma, one would like to know, why is the zero field fertile? And the traditional response is that is a mystery. It's deeper than understanding an answer to a question which is already defined and quantized, which means that the question itself has no bearing whatsoever in terms of the zero field that is fertile. So that there is a limitation, and the limitation can only be sensed when there is not the perception, but the awareness initially. The awareness that in between the ones is the space, not the space between the ones, but the space that occurs as the field within which the ones are distinguishable. So that the energy between the ones that makes them quanta is a fertile zero field. And we call this the quantum field. The quanta within the field. And so the latest thrust in 21st century physics is to understand, to be aware that there is a contemplation about the quantum field. It's called quantum field theory. There is a contemplation which is glaringly obvious once one raises awareness to consciousness. And in order to raise awareness from the natural cycle to consciousness in further dimensions, more than 4, from 5 on, one then has to have a contemplative consciousness which is not locked into the cycle that is there in space-time. And we revert back and do a do-si-do instead of time-space, which it should really be. We call it space-time, and accurately, because in the universe, space-time is the way in which they are integrated, because the whole emergence into quantification is integral. Every aspect, all the time, everywhere, is an integral. You can have awareness, but you can't have consciousness. And consciousness occurs in another field. Not in the zero field. It's another field which is an infinite field. And that infinite field is a complement to the integral. It's differential. And so the differential field of consciousness, the traditional way which I use, is that it's accessed when you mature awareness through its complexities into vision. So vision is that field of differential consciousness, and nature is that field of zero, which is fertilized because those two fields like each other. And because they like each other, they have something more mysterious than synergy. And that mysteriousness reveals as a possibility in consciousness, as a glimmer, an insight, a spark, that there must be a third field. And the time-honored high Dharma way of saying that's the field of the real. But for the field of the real, which is the fertilized zero field, space has to undergo a double transform and carry with it time through that double transform. And the first transform is where it's still space-time, and the second transform is when it's time-space. And the space of time-space we call conveniently hyperspace, a 10-dimensional hyperspace. And the saying in string theory, there are three kinds of time, three kinds of space, but only one kind of time. It's counterintuitive, it's counter-awareness, it's even paradoxical when one in the high Dharma understands it. But in reality, it's simpler than 1, 2, 3. The fact that babies smile is mysterious. Those toothless grins, which are not a response to some kind of a stimulus, but they're a sharing of a continuity, a continuum. Because they are real, there is a field of differential consciousness operative as well as the integral field, zero field of nature. So the baby and its emergence as a birth is an incredible, not just a metaphor or even event, but a revelation. And that there can be a second birth, a rebirth, means that one has gone into the differential conscious field, has begun, and it's like having taken your first step into the surf of the ocean. And as you get used to it, as you get used to the fact that you can swim in it, you can sail in it, you can dive in it, and by the 21st century you can dive 7 miles deep, like James Cameron did. Or you can go so far above it that you can see the entirety of the ocean is just a metaphor of the world, which is a world indeed, but it is a planet in a much larger ocean. An ocean, as the Islamic saying, in which no ore is dipped. The vast desert is an ocean in which no ore is dipped. And so one needs to understand, to mature, your awareness that you are dynamic within an oceanic mystery. And this is one of the qualities of Islam. Because in Islam, there was no period in which a scholastic crystallization of snippets of wisdom being pastiched together as some kind of rational structure, which was simply an idea, simply a mental picture, if you will. And so it's important. And one of the great figures in the 20th century was Henri Corbin. Henri Corbin grew up to be a French savant, meaning a very wise person. There can be, my spirit mother was a female French savant. Henri Corbin lived 75 years, and his first really impressive book that came out, reprinted here, but an early edition when Shambhala Books was still just a little tiny thing. Shambhala originally was a bookstore in Berkeley that was in the basement of a building owned by the wife of Mo, who owned Mo's Books, and they built from there. It's called The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism. And it's interesting because Corbin, being a savant, understood all the layered ways in which he had come to be understanding about the centrality of the idea of the man of light was not at all the consciousness of the man of light. It was gratifying to be able to have that idea, that conception of it, as the center, as even the axis, not just a dot center, but a whole axis, which gives a rotational energy, not only rotational clockwise, but rotational anti-clockwise as well, and that double chiral, double helix of the dynamic of rotational time in its symmetries will give us the double helix, which is a structure which allows for all of the double transforms to have their quanta depositions within a dynamic of a double rotational dynamic of time that also allows for what was beautifully called here in Los Angeles 50s when Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda were making a translation of the Upanishads for the Vedanta Center. And they called their little book a little mentor book, like George Gamo's 1, 2, 3, Infinity that we've talked about. And they called the little volume The Breath of the Eternal. The breath, that inhalation and that exhalation has a deep symmetry, and its symmetry is such that it evokes a second symmetry. The first symmetry, breathing in and breathing out, is universal, respiration. It's natural. But when that naturalness is put out of awareness, into the differential field of consciousness, now there is a realization that there is a imperceptible but nevertheless real turning point. Then there is a microsecond or if you like, a nanosecond, or if you want to get really scientific, a picosecond, or if you want to get really 21st century, a femtosecond, or deeper into the century, an attosecond, regardless. And one can go on that way, believe me, for a very long time. There's more particularity available even now in the 21st century than you could shake an idea at. A book was just published this year called The Time, the Powers of 10. Gerard de Hooft and a friend of his published it in the Netherlands. The Dutch are always far out. And they still are. That is the almost imperceptible and yet to differential consciousness, it is recognizable turning point where you've stopped breathing in and you have not yet begun to breathe out. It's the pause that refreshes. And it happens the same in the that cognate, time infinitesimal, occurs when you stop breathing out and you start breathing in. And so in a yoga, there is a balance of two symmetries. One of them is a symmetry of breathing in and breathing out, just like a piston in a mechanical dynamic. But there is another pair that is the axial context of the zero field, and that is those pivots where you shift to the other aspect of what is seemingly the power in the piston, and it's only that the power is in those infinite attosecond pauses that are really axial, because they are the fertile zero field that is giving spontaneous birth to what is actual. Not just microsecond by microsecond, or picosecond by picosecond, or femtosecond. The motion of molecules is femto. At Caltech, an Egyptian genius from Alexandria in the 20th century, Ahmad Zewal, is the one who did the first textbooks, 2 big volumes on femtochemistry. I'll bring them next week if you like to see them. But their atomic movement level, not just the molecular, but the way that atomic movement happens is second level. And it's really on the attosecond level that there is a contact with the integral coming spontaneously with time and then instantly with space in 3 dimensions. That 4-dimensional space-time has a quality where the together, 2 and 2, 2 pairs together, will make a square. And it's not just that there is a mental frame, although that is how the language goes, and one speaks of within the frame, the really big frame is the big picture. That's chicken feed. You're just feeding the chicks in the hen yard. A yoga has that quality of being able to show it's not the posture of the breathing, it's the spontaneous participation in that other axial, what would be a zero, now is an infinite conscious field. And so one then says in a really sophisticated, high Dharma yoga that one then practices pranayama. Pranayama is the ability to give and the name doesn't come because you examine something and it figures this way and that. It's spontaneous. A name for real is the seed of a poetic. And if you don't know that, you need to continue to learn. And if you forget it, learn more. One of the great scrolls in China, done about the time that they did their first printing. The first book was printed in 898 AD. It's the Diamond Sutra, the Vajrachandika Sutra, the Diamond Cutter Sutra. Because the jewel is not there in nature, in the raw. The jewel must be cut by facets. And those facets have a geometry. They're not just crystals with facets, they're jewels because there are conscious super facets that are put in. And when you have a diamond that is really cut fabulously, it has a scintillating power of disclosing not the glint of the lights so much, yes, that, but one becomes spontaneously aware that this happens before instantaneously. That jewel is real because it doesn't stay put in the universe, which indeed is made instantaneously because of space. The integral happens instantaneously, or even spontaneously because of time. Time happens a quadrillionth of an attosecond before space. Time is spontaneous, space is instantaneous, presuming that there's time already. It is quality where it is important to not be real, but to let occur what is real, not what is real, or even reality. To say, as 50 years ago, let it be, is again feeding chicks in the rooster yard. It is not it. When the older Alan Watts understood that all of his Zen lectures had been so much fluff, he wrote a short little book called It. It was like a mea culpa confession. When he died, he was only 57 in Mill Valley because he kept trying to juice it up with drugs and quip mania. The young Alan Watts, I heard him lecture at the University of Wisconsin when he was fresh from England with the short cut hair and the olive drab suit and the beautiful tie, and just absolutely a magician. At 57, he was worn out. It's not a question of that kind of force feeding to get super or hyper. Super and hyper have been here longer than the universe. But they are free in the zero field and free in the infinite field and courtesy of the field of the real. So humility is not a small thing at all. At all. In Islam, which was never subjected to the granulation by the scholastic reductionism, which began to come in actually in the 300s, right after the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, which was overseen by a man named Eusebius. He was born and raised in Caesarea on the coast and was magnificent. His whole heritage came because of education that was set up by Origen, who had learned it in Alexandria from old Pantaeus, and his classmate was Clement of Alexandria. And so Eusebius knew what he was doing. And his History of the Church is one of the great classics, and hardly read anymore because, for one thing, he says that the earliest trace that we have of the way in which we Christians do things is in a Jew named Philo. And when we read, especially Philo's contemplative life, we can recognize they're already then and there Christians, because we have the same processes that we do, language that we use. Philo wrote in Greek, and the Greek word for contemplation is theoria, out of which we get theory. A theory expresses that already one has moved into a differential conscious dimension, a fifth dimension, a fifth business that makes the universe magical, and then it makes it artistic. Because when one is working with 5 dimensions, spontaneously what comes out is art. Artistic. It's in the elan of differential consciousness to spontaneously begin something. You're not sure exactly what it is. You're not caring exactly what it is. You're not even caring that it is. It's happening. A 60s phrase that's still applicable. It's happening. And so one plays, but one plays like a divine child. Here it is. And that 6th dimension of art has a stability because the pairings with the other pairings now has a 3rd pairing. And those 3 pairs together are stable. They're stable. And so once you have a this and a that with an other and t'other, and put a 3rd pair in, that 3rd pair cinches that second 2 pairs. So that square now becomes a cubic. It becomes a 3-dimensional square, a cube. And so the cubedness, coming right back and bringing arithmetic as the beginnings of mathematics into play, you realize now that there is a grand synergy between squares and pairs and triple pairs and cubes. And both of them have a point of emergence, which we can call 1. And so the ancient Pythagorean way to teach it some 2,500 years ago, people were going to school, learning for the first time that the squares and the cubes are relatable because their ratio will always have a oneness, a unity to them. So you go 1, 2, 4, 8, 1, 3, 9, 27. The the cubing of things becomes related to the squaring of things. And this is rather universal. In astronomy, it's called Bode's law. The distance, the stable distance between all of the planets around our sun, our star, have the squares of space and the cubes of time related. And if you figure out what both of them are, and the answer has a final resolution into oneness, then your math is right. Your celestial mechanics are right. And the first person to do that lived in the time a little bit later, because he lived longer than Shakespeare, and that was Kepler. And he found, well, it isn't just that Mars then definitely has this kind of place, but that the orbit shows that that place is not circular, because it has an extension and is actually an ellipse instead of a circle. In cubic space, it's an egg. And after we come back from the break, we'll take a deeper look than this. This is just setting up, not for a card trick. We don't need cards. Let's take a break. Let's come back to how we began this morning. Establishing what early 21st century astrophysics, subatomic physics, 21st century science is understanding for some while. When the quanta was recognized in the late 1890s, 1897, the 19th century had progressively dematerialized its scientific understanding of the world and of the universe. When you began in 1800, you had a very solid, graspable, conquerable world, best personified in all of its garish grandeur as Napoleon. And progressively, as the 19th century wore on, and the development of science began to go not just by leaps and bounds, but by a dynamic that sped up and accumulated. So that by the mid-1890s, the fraying of the conviction that there was a big picture, that there was an empire, that there was this world that is understandable, began to fray. In English terms, it moved from the Victorian Empire to the Edwardian mysteriousness of London, the London of Sherlock Holmes. And quickly, quote, devolved from that into World War I. And any shred of the old was granulated. And all of the attempts since then have been people taking sawdust and adding glue to make chipboard. There is no civilization. Coming to the fore, increasingly during the 20th century, were peoples marginalized previously, not just left out, but dismissed. Two of the very large populations are people of color and people of gender. So it's not surprising at all that having found that chipboard doesn't build to last anyway, that the recognition that all of this is more fragile than a house of cards two black women in India exemplify the tremendous understanding of recalibration that has happened and has yet to come into recognition even among those who make their living as professional academics. One of them we have talked about extensively, and her name, Malati Shengi. She goes with the initial J, Malati J. Shengi. Her great book is The Civilized Demons, the Harappans in Rig Veda, and her investigations of the Indus civilization, Harappa, and of Mohenjo-Daro, and the whole spread of it. And the fact that in the Rig Veda, it seems to be crushed to dismissal by an Aryan invasion of whites who have powerful cohesion and come into play and reshape everything, and that what is set up then is the India that we know, the India of Kipling. The big problem for Kipling's India was the big game between Russia, China, and England. Now transposed to Russia, China, and America with British and Commonwealth and European and so forth. Most of them have never read Kipling. They don't understand that Kipling ended the sham of the great game in his great book that ended the empire, that ended the whole Kipling-esque illusion, and that book is Kim. He wrote it after he left India, was not yet in England. He wrote it in Vermont. Not far from where the Green Mountain Boys used to hold up after the American Revolution. Kim does not play in the great game that he was trained to do, he found his Lama, his Tibetan Lama, who was able to mature him, to bring him out of the great game, bring him out of being a little dark brown boy from India to realizing that one can rise above the illusion. All of it. All of them. The end of Kim realizes that the arrow that is shot from the bow of the archer who understood that Vajrayana has fallen into a special hidden river, and that if one can find and immerse oneself in that rhythm, that river, that whole rhythm of deception shows itself to be a mechanical, cardboard, false impersonation of a dance. And one is delivered into the dance of the real. And the end of Kim, if you will read it, says that that is what occurred for Kim. Malati shows that the Indus civilization, those black Indians of the Indus civilization indigenous to India, indigenous by going back as far back as the Paleolithic goes and even farther, had a marvelous civilization, had tremendous trading on a massive scale with the Mesopotamia of Sargon of Akkad 4,400 years ago. And there are two great urban centers with subsidiary urban centers, cities. Hundreds of thousands of people in Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa and many other smaller and yet sizable cities. In Harappa, the granaries were so enormous and huge that you had dozens and dozens of granaries that were more than football field in length, because they're dealing with fertility of grain, fertility of other kinds of goods were going out in huge trades, and there were caravan routes going those thousands of miles between India and not just a Mesopotamia, Sargon's whole Fertile Crescent civilization spread from the Indus to the island of Cyprus. So you had everything from India into the Mediterranean, and if you got as far as Cyprus, you were just one ship away from Crete and the Aegean. So that Greece and India, some 4,400 years ago, had a synergy, widespread. And not just that India of the northwest, but all down to the Bay of Bengal. So that you had a wave of civilization, even then, that went from the Irish Sea to the Bay of Bengal. In its comprehensiveness, she has brought back the fact that there was no Aryan invasion. There were instead a very sophisticated quality of literate, able to write persons who came originally from Central Asia. They came from around, originally from where Samarkand is. And for them, their great river was the Amu Darya, sometimes in British Empire called the Oxus. Arnold Toynbee has a wonderful travel book of a world great historian, from the Jumna in India to the Oxus in Central Asia, because this is the spread of Alexander the Great, who in 330 BC recognized in his vision, a vision that was first seeded to him by his tutor, Aristotle, that Aristotle had learned over 20 years of studying with Plato. And Plato had learned over his years of studying with Socrates, who had learned from his years of studying with Diotima of Mantinea, a woman, who showed him that love is the real out of which the energy of time and the integral of space occurs, as love has a reality in beauty. Something which Plotinus eloquently, some 600 years after Alexander's founding of Alexandria, was able to still make quite discursively rare in language, eloquent, but nevertheless there. You can read Plotinus on beauty. All of us have read it for 1,700 years. But we go back not only to Alexandria, now we go all the way back to when Black India, discovered now by Black Indian women, was exactly this interesting kind of interplay. In geology, there's a process where the intrusion of something into a matrix gets the interface blends, and this is how rare minerals are made. So that in a place like India, and there are other places like it, there are rare minerals that are made that give the body politic a different scalar out of which they can compose. A new standard of health. And in the same time that Malati is doing this, and Amika Roy is doing the investigation of the great Amaravati Stupa. This is a model that is made now in the museum that is there at Amaravati. And this is volume 1. The other volume 2 is here. And published in 1994, about the same time that Malati was beginning to publish her great books. And it's interesting because Amaravati, the original stupa, the original site, like so many different original sites in India, were founded by another Black Indian whose father was a contemporary of Alexander the Great. His name was Chandragupta, and he was a masterful general. He founded the Mauryan dynasty, Mauryan. And it was Chandragupta Maurya who paraded his elephant tanks on the other side of the several miles wide Ganges River and showed Alexander that he had sophisticated platooning of his troops, and that his infantry was not just on horses, they were on elephants. And that he was welcome to try to swim his troops or row his troops across the Ganges. They will be met wherever they choose to cross. And Alexander's men refused to go on. An unheard of thing. Because there is no way that they could win that. The vision was right. The vision was true. And the vision has been true, has been right all this time. But the decision not to fight crossing the Ganges was the right one. So Chandragupta, respecting Alexander, respecting not only Alexander but his vision, and more than being able to deploy his troops in a kind of a Greek phalanx mobile power, he was able to pass on his vision, but it wasn't received by any of his sons except one. And all the other sons were after power militarily, politically, empire, dynasty. It's ours. India's ours. And we're going to extend it. It goes all the way into what we call today Afghanistan, and we're going into what we call today Indochina, and we're it. They, internecine wars, killed all of them off and left the runt of the pack. Not that he was small, but because he was a mulatto. He had the gold eyes and speckled skin, woolly hair, that cognated to these empire builders as he's like just a native. Well, that native's name was Ashoka. And he showed himself to be the most superior general of his era. He's a contemporary of Ptolemy, who was the superior general after Alexander, who took the prize when all the other generals wanted this area, this district, that province, this, that. He said, I'm going to build Alexander's city, Alexandria, and all of Egypt is mine, which meant not just Egypt, but all of that whole stretch of North Africa, Libya, and so forth. He's the one that commandeered the body of Alexander, sent trained cohorts to fetch the body, to put it into a glass and gold coffin, a huge entourage, carriage, plumed horses, and brought it all the way back and put it in the center of what he was building, the city, where the two great boulevards crossed. Boulevards 10 chariots wide. And all the buildings on those boulevards had to be of white marble. The boulevards were of white marble, so it was said that in the moonlight one could read codexes, if there were codexes, but the scrolls, in the moonlight, because the city shone. So it was a city of light. It was that classic Alexandria. And right at the center, on the northwest corner, is where the Soma, meaning the body, the temple of the body, and Alexander the Great's body was disclosed publicly. Everyone could see this is all real. It's there. When Augustus Caesar took over, having defeated Mark Antony, shamed him into wanting to throw himself into a suicide charge, and they obliged him. Wanted to keep Cleopatra alive as his trophy, to take her back to his great triumph in Rome and show her off in chains. But to gloat, he pushed everyone out of the Soma and left himself there for a night to absorb the energy of the body of Alexandria. He had the glass of the coffin raised so that alone he reached down to see, is this so, and touched the nose of the mummified Alexander and broke the tip. The finger that then pointed to the rest of the world and said, I'm not the big tyrant. All I am is the first. So what I'm setting up is not so much an empire, but a principate. I'm the first person. So when it comes to speaking out of what we should do, I am the first who speaks, and the rest of you can choose to speak as you like after you have heard me. When Napoleon came to power, he called himself first citizen. A real dictator doesn't claim power, he demands it in terms of obedience. This is the way it is. What are you going to do about it? Do you want to live? That's how it works. That's where we are now. The vying for those who want to say, we control the genome, we control the finances, we have all the military might. You can choose whatever you want to do, but it's important for you to recognize that this is the way it is. This is not the way it is. It never has been. It never will be. Amaravati was built by a black Indian. His name was Nagarjuna. He was the greatest philosopher of his whole era. He also built a site on the same river, the Krishna River, one of the great rivers of South India. The Krishna weaves its way all the way into almost to the mountain range that's by the western mountain ranges of India. The other river, the Godavari, is even longer and stretches all the way up almost to above where Bombay, now called by a different name. And when the Krishna River has this big, huge bend in it with about 50 miles in between, Amaravati is on the south side of the river in one place, and all the way around that horseshoe bend in another is where Nagarjuna set up his ashram. And both places were because they were ancient sites that Ashoka had originally seeded. The earliest Amaravati stupa was a little stupa. A stupa is a bell-shaped architecture that commemorates a vestige of the Buddha. The Temple of the Tooth in Ceylon is because one of Buddha's teeth survived, and it's there in Sri Lanka. The Temple of the Tooth up near the central sacred area in the island. The same at what became Nagarjuna Khanda. Khanda in that dialect there is hill, the hill of Nagarjuna. Because like the greatest philosopher in ancient Egypt, who was also a doctor and an architect. His name was Imhotep. We've talked about him, who built the first pyramids for Zoser, third pharaoh in the Old Kingdom. Nagarjuna was on that caliber, only a greater philosopher, a greater architect, in the sense that as the pyramids reached an apex in Nagarjuna's architecture, expanded the original seeds. Ashoka's Amaravati dome was actually not very large. And it was heralded because, as Ashoka would do, he built a pillar. They're called the lion pillars. There are 4 lines lines for each of the 4 directions, but lines for each of the pairs of that square become 3-dimensional, become the cube in a differential extension. It isn't a cube in a closed integral geometry. It's a cube because it goes in the 4 directions indefinitely, because it's a harmonic based on resonance. And anyone within that resonance who keeps their pair of pairs will find that 3rd pair of the tuning fork of that resonance to make real and make viable and make living as a presence whatever it is that they are consciously bringing into play. So that it is incumbent for the 21st century to begin to understand that when you come to the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s of physics, of astrophysics, of particle physics, you have to begin to understand that quantum field theory is concerned with quantum fluctuations. Where are the quantum fluctuations? They are in the energy, the vacuum. They're the energy in the vacuum. How can a vacuum have fluctuations? How can they have quantum fluctuations? That translates into gravity. That's where gravity comes from. It comes from dark matter having dark energy course through it, bringing the dark matter into spatiality as space, so that space itself blossoms out of time, so that the fluctuations are due to time. They're due to time energy, which spontaneously emerges and occurs, and spontaneously absorbs and doesn't occur so many times per whatever time unit you want to have. Do you want to have nanoseconds? Do you want to have picoseconds? Will you settle for femtoseconds or attoseconds? How fine do you want to grind? Vibration is quite real. A harmonic is the way in which resonant sets have integrals and also at the same time differentials, so that current quantum field theory, a la, say, Alan Gust's expanding universe, is said to have repulsive gravity, repulsive gravitation. Correction. Poetic. That's bad usage. It's differential. It is a differential rather than a repulsion gravitation. And the differential gravitation is the free form play in a fertile vacuum that is real. More next week.